There are a couple of parts to the story that we have for today. One part is what many of us traditionally hear on the week after Easter, which is this story about Thomas not really believing that Jesus has come back to life unless he can see for himself, unless he can touch the wounds in his hands and put his fingers in the wound on Jesus' side. Many times when we tell this story, the part of the story that we'll focus on is Thomas doubting what the other disciples are telling him about Jesus. In fact, that's become the focus of this story so much that Thomas has even picked up the nickname Doubting Thomas. Now, there are some worthwhile things that we could learn from focusing on the part of the story where Thomas doubts the other disciples. But there are some problems with making this the focus of the story. Perhaps the biggest problem here is that Thomas's doubts are not the point of this story, and they're not actually the reason that this story is included in this particular gospel story. To understand the point of the story, we have to first know who this was written to and when this story was finally written down. Each of the gospel stories is attributed to a different disciple. But to say that those individual disciples actually penned every word of their stories, well, may or may not be accurate. Perhaps a better way to say it is that each of the disciples went out and told their version of the gospel story to the communities that they helped start. Each of those communities then kept telling the version of the story they were told over and over again. After a while, for a variety of reasons, those communities finally wrote down the version of the story that was passed on to them by their founder. The gospel stories, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were all written down about 60 to 70 A.D., which is within 15 to 30 years of when Jesus lived, which means that Jesus being alive was within the living memory of the generation of believers that wrote those stories down. The Gospel of John, however, well, that's a different story. John was probably written down much later, anywhere between 90 and 110 A.D. This means a number of different things, but the most important one for this story is the fact that by the time this story was written down, virtually all of the believers who were a part of John's community were second-generation believers, meaning that they were all born after Jesus had lived and died, which means that they would never have even had the chance to know about Jesus firsthand, let alone have seen him themselves. When we remember this setting, and we go back to the story from John, and we look at the last line of the Thomas story, well, then we can really see who this story is for, and why it was included in this version of the gospel story. After Thomas doubts the disciples, and then Jesus appears and lets Thomas touch his hands and his side, then Jesus says what is really the point of the story. Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. That is a direct blessing for the second generation of believers in John's community. It's an affirmation of the faith of people who feel like they missed out because they didn't get to see Jesus like their parents or grandparents did. It also happens to be an affirmation for all of us who were born thousands of years later and still have come to believe in Jesus as well. See, in this scripture about Jesus appearing to the disciples as well as to Thomas, this is the reason that the Thomas story is included in John's gospel story. But that being said, for today, I actually don't think that this particular part of the story is what we need to hear the most. I think that we need to hear what comes in the first part of this story, when Jesus first appears to the disciples after the resurrection. In all four Gospels, Jesus appears to the disciples in some form or another. But it's only in John and Luke that Jesus appears to a group of disciples who are hiding together as a group. And in both stories, we find that fear is a large part of the emotions that they are feeling. And I think what Jesus says in John and Luke really has something to offer to us today. At the beginning of this scripture in John, it says that a group of disciples were in a house together, and they had locked themselves inside because they were afraid. Specifically, they were afraid of what Jewish leaders might do to them because they were associated with Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, the disciples are gathering back together after a couple of them have had an encounter with Jesus while walking on the road to Emmaus, even though they didn't actually know it was him while they were walking. The two disciples that encountered Jesus on the road run back to the others and tell them what has happened. And while they're together, Jesus appears to them. And the scripture says that they were startled and terrified because they thought they were seeing a ghost. It might be easy for us to read about the disciples from our perspective and to minimize their fears. Sure, we know the rest of the story and what happens in the New Testament, as well as the last couple thousand years. But to write off their fears as unfounded, well, that's too easy. And it just isn't fair to where they're at. See, the disciples had a very good reason to be afraid of the other Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders as well. They were closely and publicly associated with Jesus. They were in a parade just a little over a week before this when they were coming into Jerusalem with Jesus, as though they were going to be taking over the place, and a crowd of people all got a very good look at them. It's only a couple of days after their leader has been killed in a particularly brutal and public way. They had very good reasons to be very afraid of some very powerful people who were more than happy to use the police and the military in a very brutal kind of way. What's more, when Jesus appears to them out of thin air, they have some good reason to be terrified as well. I mean, it's not every day that you see someone breathe their last breath after having been nailed to a chunk of wood and having a spear shoved into their ribs, only to suddenly have that person standing in front of you, breathing and talking and asking you for a snack. I think the word fear wouldn't even begin to describe the kind of emotions I would have if I was there. Their fear was real and legitimate. And then Jesus speaks to them. What Jesus says to them, both in the Gospel of John, but specifically in the Gospel of Luke, is really quite profound. As the disciples find themselves full of fear, Jesus does not say to them, "Oh, don't be afraid." He doesn't say to them, "Just relax, there's nothing to be afraid of." He does not say, "Calm down, you're just overreacting." Jesus does not minimize their fear or ignore it. Instead, Jesus offers them what they really want and what they really need. Jesus says to them, "Peace be with you." Perhaps even more profoundly in Luke, not only does Jesus begin with bringing them peace, but he also asks them to name their fears. And then Jesus actually addresses their real fears. Luke 24:36 says, "While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, 'Why are you frightened? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my feet and my hands. See that it is I, myself. Touch me and see. For a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have.' And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet." In the face of very real and serious fears, Jesus begins by offering them some of his peace. And then he helps them through their fears by asking them to name what they are afraid of, and then gives them what they need to release those fears. I don't know about you, but fear seems to be a constant companion for me these days. Yes, I realize that some of the fear that I feel is unnecessary and manufactured. Virtually any amount of time spent watching cable news or scrolling through Facebook will set fire to a whole group of things that I didn't even know I needed to be afraid of. Most of which I don't actually need to be afraid of and are being put into my head by people who can profit off of my fears. But those aren't the fears that I'm talking about. There are real things to be afraid of. Will people that I love stay healthy through this pandemic? Will people that I care about be able to survive financially through all of this? How is our community going to change in the coming months? What's going to happen to our church in the future? For that matter, what will happen to other churches that we know who are already on the edge of survival? Will our political system be transformed for the good of more people, or will powerful people bend it towards their personal benefit? How will the poor and vulnerable people that I know bear the brunt of this in ways that others don't? Will my family stay healthy and safe? Will we be able to make it through? There are real fears that we all have. And yes, I think we need to hear the same words that Jesus spoke to the disciples, but are now being spoken to each of us. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Jesus is offering us his peace. And just like in the gospel stories, the way to that peace is not by ignoring our fears or pretending like it's not real. The way through starts with naming our fears. When we can name our fears, we claim a certain amount of power over them. We can begin the process of containing them and dealing with them. And just like Jesus showed the disciples his body and addressed their fears directly, once we can name our own fears, we can then bring them to Jesus and turn them over to him. This doesn't mean that our problems will go away instantly, or that everything is all sunshine and roses. But when we can name our fears and then give them to Jesus, that is when we can begin to be freed of the grip that fear can have over our lives. When fear has its grip on me, I will often write down those fears on a piece of paper. I name the fears and write them down so they no longer live in my head, but rather can live on the paper. And then as an act of giving them to God, sometimes I will burn them in a fire, letting them go into God's hands. Name your fears. Give them to God. And know that the peace of Jesus is with you.